Well, good afternoon. Today, we are continuing our quarterly discussion on race with the book Caste, the Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson, the Pulitzer-winning best-selling author of The Warmth of Other Suns. In this book, Wilkerson examines the unspoken caste system that has shaped America and shows how our lives today are still defined by a hierarchy of human divisions. And I'm so glad to have three panelists with us that will help us and walk us through this particular book. The first person that I'd like to introduce is Stephen Ragsdale, who serves as an associate faculty member of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Stephen is a senior consultant and former administrator with over 25 years building and managing hospital operations, developing healthcare innovations and advancing pathways to better and safer care. His work in diversity, equity, and inclusion is guided by his steep understanding of the concepts that drive difference as a social construct and how it animates group performance over time. So welcome, Stephen Ragsdale. I'd like now to welcome Dr. Norma Day Vines. And Dr. Vines serves as Associate Dean for Faculty Development in the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. And she also maintains a faculty appointment as Professor of Counseling and Educational Studies. Dr. Day Vines' research agenda examines the importance of multiculturalism as an indispensable tool in the delivery of culturally competent counseling and educational services for clients and students from marginalized groups. More specifically, she specializes in the measurement of attitudes toward discussing the contextual dimensions of race, ethnicity, and culture with ethnic minority clients, students, and the identification of strategies that reduce barriers to well-being. Thank you, Dr. Norma Day Vines. And I want to welcome Marty Brown Bailey, who serves as the director of the Sibley Senior Association and Community Health at Sibley Memorial Hospital, part of the Johns Hopkins Medicine Network. She is a proven leader with innovative and workable ideas. She is committed to partnering with older adults to help them achieve purpose, passion, and pleasure in life. She has a broad range of experience and she's mentored many people. She excels in program development, public speaking, caregiver support, marketing, training, and she's dedicated to overcoming barriers to health and has worked extensively in underserved areas. I'd like to certainly welcome Marty Brown Bailey to our panel as well. I am going to get started. I must say that there is a storm brewing in our midst, and I certainly hope that that will not interfere with anything that is going on right now. Certainly, I encourage everyone to put any questions in the chat room, and we'll do our best to get to any and all questions as we get started. Well, right now, I'm going to actually put it on speaker mode for all of us, and we'll kind of toggle back and forth. But what I want to do right now is to begin our discussion. Isabel Wilkerson uses many metaphors and comparisons to help us understand the significance of a caste system. And I thought this might be helpful so that we're all on the same page as we move forward. A caste system, she writes, is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits that would be neutral in the abstract but are ascribed life and death meaning. Her second comparison goes like this. It says, America has an unseen skeleton a caste system that is as central to its operation as are the studs and joists that we cannot see in the physical buildings we call home. In a caste system, you are assigned a place that has nothing to do with anything you have done. You're born into it. And the other two comparisons go similarly. As we go about our daily lives, caste is the wordless usher in a darkened theater, flashlight cast down in the aisles, guiding us to our assigned seats for performance. The hierarchy of caste is not about feelings or morality, rather it's about power, which groups have it and which do not. And the very last comparison she says is that caste is insidious and therefore powerful because it is not hatred. It is not necessarily personal. It is the worn grooves of comforting routines and unthinking expectations, patterns of a social order that have been in place for so long that it looks like the natural order of things. Well, I'd like to open it up to the panel right now. Which of these metaphors or comparisons helped you most to understand caste?
I'll jump in. I'm hoping to hear from others on this question, but the second one, the joists and studs, the invisibility of that resonated with me in just in so many ways. Literally because of my my background, my personal background, my academic background, starts out mostly as a search for self-discovery and trying to find out how I fit into the world. And fitting into the world, given the fact that my dad had been a biomedical photographer at Johns Hopkins University in 1957, while the great majority of my other local Baltimore relatives were relegated to jobs in housekeeping and in patient transport, kind of like had me looking at life a lot of times through a couple of different lenses, trying to make sense of like not only how I fit into the world, but how like the certain order of things, and one of the things that I always kind of understood, by going to either majority culture schools or schools dedicated to minority education was you see and feel difference, right? And I mean, like the delta, the difference in investment, the difference in opportunity, the difference in structural ladders, just different. And no one ever really explains to you, and your parents do their best, even, given their, even if they have a broadened scope, to kind of explain to you how you fit into the world, but it's never really clear, like the social order. And I think that what the author does in this book is she makes clear lines of demarcation around like this invisible social order that we all subscribe to, and very few people question, right? Because it's so deeply and so steeply ingrained in our very nature and our economies, in the way that we think, that and you see it evidenced in allostatic load, right? In minority communities, right? The use of drugs, the overuse, of community-based trauma, self-inflicted harm. When I first started in public health, one of the things, and I'm going to end on this note, was, I was always struck by this notion that Black men didn't kill themselves. That was the notion in public health. And then I looked at public health data and I was like, of course they do, but slowly. It's a slow demise of self-destruction, right? And that's grounded in like how they perceive themselves to be valued, not only to themselves, but in their own community.
Thank you, Stephen. Does anyone else want to comment on any of the metaphors that I mentioned?
I don't know that I had a favorite metaphor, but I think all of them resonated with me. Can we choose a metaphor that you didn't mention? Or
Absolutely, yes.
So for me, the metaphor that resonated most was the 8 pillars of caste. And so when you think about a pillar as a foundation, and it just all made sense, how you start out with using religiosity as a way of, helping people sort of reinforce their subordination. And you look at issues of marriage, and you look at issues of occupation, and you see how everything is sort of built into the foundation seamlessly. And as Stephen said, without questioning, we look at things like dehumanization, cruelty, sort of legal precedents that are difficult to sort of do away with. And you see how society is shaped, organized, and sort of resistant to change. And so that really resonated with me, because you could see it from the beginning to the end, and how we are all, well, maybe not all, but many of us are unquestioning these structures.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Marty Bailey.
I think the metaphor that resonated with me, although I also get them all, but the one that resonates the most with me is the groove. I think of that more, I probably use the word rut. And I think about like when they're working on a highway and they put the tarmac on, or they put the asphalt on, and you've got one piece of asphalt higher than the other. And, it's very, very difficult to get up to that higher level of asphalt. And that's kind of what I think of when I think of the Ms. Wilkerson's work, is that we're so much in a rut of 400 years of exploitation and abuse and trauma infliction that it's very difficult for anybody to get to that, out of that groove or rut. And so that's what was on my mind.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bailey. I want to move on to another question, and that is, Wilkerson discusses 3 major caste systems throughout the book: India, Nazi Germany, and America. And they enable her to make unsettling comparisons between India's treatment of its untouchables, or Dalits, Nazi Germany's treatment of Jews, and America's treatment of African Americans. Each country relied on stigmatizing those deemed inferior to justify the dehumanization necessary to keep the lowest ranked people at the bottom, and to rationalize the protocols of enforcement. This is a twofold question. Do you feel that there are differences that stood out to you among these 3 systems? And then the second part is, did the fact that the Nazis actually studied America's segregation practices and Jim Crow laws help underscore the breadth of our own system? Who would like to start with that?
I'm happy to, oh, go ahead, Dr. Devines.
Yeah. Oh, please call me Norma. But I was struck, that was a part of the book that really struck me. When you think about the fact that the Nazis came to the US, because the history that we learn in schools is so sanitized. You know, we think of America as, you know, sort of being honest and oriented towards sort of egalitarianism, and that's not really the case. And the fact, and when we think about the inflection point that we've reached today, where there is so much polarization around race and class, and that is really striking. And we look at the white nationalists and the, you know, the rise of, well, the perpetuation of white supremacy. And when we think about the monuments that we have that people are fighting over whether to keep up or bring down, and in the book it talks about in Germany there was never a question. There was no monument to what happened. In fact, it's really against the law. And there are reminders throughout Berlin to help people remember what happened to the Jews during this extermination period. And,
Exactly.
and so that is really striking, and it speaks to the hypocrisy of the US in terms of trying to diminish or to play down what really happened.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So I too was struck by that, but in a different historical lens. I mean, as a historian, you know, as a person who focuses a lot on the history, like one of the most treasured, and I should say this kind of tongue in cheek, volumes that I have on behind me is a 2-volume set called the Encyclopedia of Genocide, right?
Mm.
Now, it's 2 volumes and it's written in this encyclopedic formulary. So the verse or designations only maybe like a quarter of a page long, but you kind of get, you know, a sense of, you know, world history through the lens of like how many different cultures have been exterminated off of this planet, right? Now, I say all of that to say that we spoke about the Nuremberg, you know, with things that happened in Nuremberg and those kind of discoveries. But little is known that I think that 40 or 50 years before Nazi Germany, the Germans marched a tribe of Africans into the desert. And you know, and part of the design was to determine how long it would take them to either starve to death or to die from from lack of water. You know, I like our lack of understanding around what has been done, not only in the name of of supremacy, but through the lens of economic development, you know, and what it means to be a shaded human, right? You know, because like everybody's in this game. It's not only a lower caste system, there has to be a middle caste and, you know, and a dominant caste, right? And how folks kind of easily, you know, slip into those roles. But I think that there's a wider discussion, you know, that's going on, like, and a lack of understanding around like our humanity, or I'm sorry, our lack of humanity, and our lack of understanding around like how easy it's been to kind of like repeat these genocidal activities. You know, like there are certain indigenous tribes in America that no longer exist, not a single human being. You know, I mean, and so like, and so, you know, I mean, she talks about the millennial caste system in India, and she talks about the Jews, the Jewish population, and their relationship to Germany. But it's way more complicated than that. Like, you have an opportunity to look at the history of China. And I would argue that in 19th century China, it's a caste system, and a very complicated caste system. But again, I think this idea around like taking a person and assigning them through systematic practices, a value, to the extent that, like, if your value isn't such that they're able to kind of like wipe you away from the planet, is a strong impulse that has happened in a variety of places that I think we need to know a little bit more about.
Thank you, Mr. Ragsdale.
From my standpoint, I was thinking about, and Norma mentioned this earlier, about the sanitizing of history. I think, actually, Stephen, I think you referred to it as well. Sanitizing of history, so much so that that when I read it, I was shocked to discover that so much of what happened to the Jews, that the structures and the foundations were coming from treatment of Blacks in the United States. I was floored by it. And I'm a person that loves history, but never heard that ever discussed, never read it anywhere. And so I found it
Rather unsettling, I'm sure.
Pardon?
I was going to say it was probably rather unsettling. I mean, to learn that.
It was unsettling. It's not that. So I'm a Native American, and so it wasn't totally surprising to hear, and yet at the same time, it was information I didn't know, and it made a lot of sense after I read it. It made a lot of sense. It seemed like from the time that Hitler came to power to the time that we were in full-scale war, that there was such a systematic change that it made sense to me after it was brought to my attention. But very sanitized history, and we're continuing to do that.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. One other thing that I think I want to, move on to has to do with some of the terms that we've all talked about. One thing that I think Isabel Wilkerson has talked about before is she's really discussed how overt racism has kind of subtly transformed into unconscious bias. And I'm just wondering, do you think there are ways that we can work to kind of compensate for the unconscious biases that are so inherent in a caste system?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like, one of the things that unconscious bias is, first off, it's an emotional trigger in most instances, right? I mean, when you study the brain, the neurons of the brain, there's activity centers that light up around this, right? I mean, and so one of the things that we understand is systematized learned behavior. And anything that can be learned, I'm a firm believer can be unlearned, right? I mean, and like the longer I study this, the more I'm able to simplify this down to two notions. That we exist in this space often because people have been deprived of, like, the story. Or you've been sold a bill of goods about how you or your group has participated in that story. And that's in a variety of places. I often have conversations with all Black audience about colorism, right? And how we subscribe to economic notions, you know, by within the community based on the tone and shade of your skin, which is an antiquated notion derived from slavery, you know, and slave breeding, you know, and being close to the progeny of, you know, of majority culture, right? I mean, and so like being able to kind of like unpack those notions and to, you know, have deeper dives and deeper conversations and create wider understanding, much like you guys are doing today, you know, to give people the opportunity to kind of like not only learn these notions, but to learn how to live and breathe with them. You know what I mean? Because this makes us really uptight, you know, in a lot of spaces, you know, and but like I always, you know, my subscription, the thing I tell my 10-year-old, you know, like learning is part of the battle. You know, you gotta, you know, that's the pain point. Once we hit the pain point, you know, I think things become a little bit more simpler.
Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Ragsdale. Anyone else have any comments, certainly having to do with, you know, where we are now and how did we get to this point, and how is it that, you know, we are constantly, you know, dealing with this racial hierarchy. And I guess kind of really what I want to talk about is somehow when we start talking about the various caste systems, are you hopeful? Are you at all hopeful that there indeed are ways that we individually can move forward to and take steps toward dismantling the caste system? And if so, what are some of the steps that society or each of us individually might do to move towards dismantling the caste system?
I'll weigh in real quickly. For me, I think allyship is something that is a really important step. It means a concerted and intentional step toward setting an intention to be clear about policy, about tax policy, economic policy, labor policy, about education policy, and being involved and actually, you know, doing something. But it really, from my perspective, as a person that presents as white, I have to live as though I am a white ally for that reason. And I'm passionate about doing that and constantly trying to understand what it means to be an ally. And so from my perspective, I have to tell you straight up, I'm still trying to get my arms around that. I do not know all of what that means to be an ally, and I don't think I can possibly know. But I am so willing to learn and to be taught. And so I think that for me, that's a place that's where I begin, is to be willing to be taught.
I think education and learning, I agree with Margie. Education and learning is really important. It's foundational, because as long as we have these notions of history that are distorted, we will have misunderstandings about what's going on. So if you think that the end of slavery made everything equal, then you would assume that there's a level playing field. But if you don't think about, if you haven't learned about the fact that when we look at disproportionate rates of incarceration of ethnic minority people, didn't just start, with the crime bill. If we go all the way back to like the slave patrols, and we go back to, convict leasing systems, and we go back to lynching. I mean, so we can go all the way back to the present, but as long as you don't know what happened in between, there's no incentive to change. There's this notion that everybody's equal. We set you free. We let you come to our schools. You can marry our women, and that is sort of really misunderstanding and distortions about what is really going on. That doesn't allow people to think about how inequities have shaped our reality. I think the other thing I would say is I am somewhat hopeful, but not entirely hopeful. But it doesn't stop me from working towards trying to help eliminate barriers and inequities. But I agree with Marty about sort of examining policies and even looking at data. So how do we use data to drive our decision making? And in a lot of places, people don't want to collect and analyze data, because as long as you don't collect and analyze data, you don't really have to look systematically at what's going on. I have a good friend that is the chair. We both serve on the board of an independent school in Montgomery County, and one of the things that she's the chairman of the board, and the head of school said in a meeting one day, we don't have problems around diversity. We didn't get the Black Act campaign sort of, I don't know if you remember right after George Floyd, a lot of African-American students at independent schools were talking about all the negative and racist things that happened to them. It's a big thing on Instagram. You can sort of identify any independent school and look at Black Act, and the things that students said were just horrific. And he said in the meeting, well, we didn't have anybody log into Instagram and lodge a complaint. And the chairman of the board said, how do you, and he said, we don't have any problems around diversity. And she said, how do you know? We haven't collected any data. And until we collect the data and we systematically examine what is going on, how people feel, we disaggregate the data and look at representation, we look at curriculum, we look at every facet of an organization to determine the extent to which we are infusing and embedding diversity practices, we won't know. So we won't know. And so I think one of the things of many, how will we use data?
Thank you.
Oh, I so appreciate both of those answers. But so mine, I think, streams along the same consciousness of both of the previous answers. And so the way that I kind of think about this is, like, my work is in systems theory, systems design, and in history. And so what are the, like, when we think in terms of this, you have to think in terms of like what created those systems and the intentionality that went into building them. I mean, and when you think about if you think about America's foundations, its economic foundations, just kind of think about factors of production, right? Like the things that you learn in Econ 101. What are the 4 factors of production? Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. America starts out stealing 2 of the 4, right? And shutting out huge portions of populations from capital and entrepreneurship, right? That's the foundation. So that's the foundation of our system. And then we place a human value on who can participate in those systems, right? And then we kind of like, before we codify it, I mean, this is where the caste thing falls in, right? We have to tell a story. We have to tell first a religious story, right? The stain of Ham, right? And then when people kind of fall away from that, then we kind of morph into this idea of the false sciences, the pseudosciences, for phrenology and, but these are all designed to do what? To kind of reinforce this economic narrative, right? That starts out over 400 years ago. right? And really still animates the way that we behave today, right? You know, our loan systems, our banking systems, a lot of the things that we do, you know, are based on the way that we have established value in human production, you know, over 400 years ago. I mean, so when I look at, I mean, I do a lot of work in Baltimore. I look at the history of Baltimore, and I look at the fact that, you know, in antebellum Baltimore, you know, you had nearly 70% of Black Baltimore being free, you know, and I mean, almost every single one of them were relegated to low wage labor. Well, when you look at current day statistics in Baltimore, you know, that 65 or 70% of low wage workers is still Black and brown. And it hasn't changed very much, you know, in literally since 1619. Right. I mean, and so like we look at these systems without really unpacking and you know, the design, you know, racism was just a feature, not, it wasn't the design. The design was an economic design, right? You know, I mean, and then we spend the entirety of the 20th century codifying that, you know, into law. Right. I mean, so like, first off, look at what we did intentionally, you know, to kind of cast the people, and then look at how we codified it so that people would not only subscribe, I mean, buy into it socially, you know, but their economics would be tied to it. So where you live depends on the, you know, like, well, what color people live in your neighborhood. That values, I mean, that brings a value to, you know, the value to the work. Who's doing the work? You know, I mean, so there are value streams that we've inculcated into society, and they are implicit biases. These are economic implicit biases. Well, I mean, you know, I mean, that go far beyond kind of like Black and white, where we like, what jobs we like to see women in, right? You know, what jobs are we comfortable watching folks who don't have an English bias? You know, I mean, so like we've created those value streams, and we kind of stick to them without an understanding of like why we do it and why we're so tied to it mentally and economically.
Thank you for sharing that, Stephen. I want to just move. I want to make certain that everyone that leaves our discussion today is real clear what caste is and the behavior and how caste has an influence on behavior. So I'm going to ask you to help me by giving some examples of how you see caste operating. You know, Wilkerson gives examples from the horrifying lynching to the absurd. Remember, she gave the example of the Indian woman who walked across the office to ask a dollar to pour her water from the jug that was right on her desk. She even gave examples of a white woman of a condo following a Black man to his door, indeed to make certain that he lived in that building because it did not appear that he should even be in that building. So I think what I'm asking you is, I want to illustrate, you know, caste's influence on behavior. And I'm just wondering, do you have any examples either from Wilkerson or just your own life, which is evident of caste, you know, having an impact on behavior?
I do, but I would like to defer to one of the ladies first. I don't want to keep going and jumping out on the ledge. Unless you, lady, would you like to defer? I will. I have a good story. All right.
Go right
Okay.
ahead.
So the one of the a story that, again, being a local historian, that I was really drawn to was the story of Howard Cooper. Howard Cooper was a man who was about 17, 18 years old, and he was lynched out in front of the Towson courthouse, or behind the Towson courthouse, for allegedly having sex with a white girl, right? I think one of this, I'm horrible with dates, but I want to say around 1888, right? And so this is when racial tensions are really heating up. But there's a predecessor group in Baltimore City, a predecessor group to the NAACP called the Mutual Brotherhood of Liberty. And they knew they couldn't get a fair trial in Maryland because the Democrats after the Civil War had taken over Maryland politics at all levels. And, you know, they were antithetical to Lincoln ideals, right? And so they took they wrote an amicus brief, you know, to the Supreme Court, and guess what? It got granted certification. For the guys in Latin, not in the legal world, that meant that the Supreme Court was going to hear the case, right? And when those white men in Towson heard that that case had been granted cert, they ran to the courthouse, started beating on the door, and you know, that's when the judge and the family, the caretakers lived on the premises. And lady's like, no, 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 don't come in my house. Go around back, right? And they snatched Howard Cooper out of the and they lynched him because his case was going to be heard by the Supreme Court. They were not going to allow it to be adjudicated. Right? Now, that's how a caste system works. It's extrajudicial law. Like, this was all within the framework of the law. And you see them, you know, trying to, this pre-NAACP legal group trying to navigate, you know, the system. But ultimately, the system wins.
All righty. Well, thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else want to chime in?
I'll mention a story from my family. I grew up in Oklahoma, and one of our family members had a business. And in that business, a Black woman named Lena was in advance, I ask your forgiveness for using this language, a shampoo girl. There is nothing that Lena couldn't do. She was competent, bright, funny, lovely in every way. But because of her caste, she was relegated to not being a principal in this hair salon, but to this particular job, which was shampoo girl. And it was the only role that was available for non-whites. And no white people were invited to be a shampoo girl, and no Black people were invited to be a stylist. And so for me, that's part of this whole economic mess, is continuing to the job descriptions being relegated to certain caste members. And that's one of the ways that I think we keep people in their caste.
Thank you, Marty.
When you asked the question about something, either from our personal lives or from the book, one of several stories that resonated with me, I think it was in the 1930s, a Black man, middle-class African-American man, goes to town to pay his water bill, then dares to ask for a receipt. And once he asked for a receipt, they beat him at the water company to within inches of his life. And to me, that, you know, sort of that is an indication of how caste operates, you know, to reinforce dehumanization.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to, in the remaining time we have, just turn to a discussion a little bit of race. Wilkerson, has argued a lot about race and the differences between race and caste. And I want to just share a couple of her words. I mean, she's always said in the United States, race is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste, meaning caste is the bones and race is the skin. So I want to just follow along that point for just a second. And I just want to talk a little bit about, caste and race not only being the same, but I want to share something else that Wilkerson had shared when we're talking about race. And she went on to talk about the construction of whiteness, okay? And she described the way immigrants went from being Czech or Hungarian or Polish to white, which is a political designation that only has meaning when set against something that is not white. And, so Irish or Italian people weren't white until they came to America. So what does this construction of whiteness, tell us about either the validity of racial designations and the structure of caste? She spent a lot of time talking about race and why do you think it's like this? I mean, even James Baldwin had said many, many years ago, there are no white people unless you live in the United States. No one is white until they get to the United States. Can you kind of expound on that, or what does that mean to you?
Okay.
Go ahead, Mr. Ragsdale.
So, when I think in terms of this question, again, I'm thinking in terms of economies and like the American economies. And I think in terms of the construction of this construct is not born around like what European whiteness looks like, but what American whiteness looks like as it is defined by slave owners. I mean, one of the things that we seldom talk about is the fact that a slave owner could breed with one of his slaves, create a mixture, right? And take the progeny and profit from that progeny, right? I mean, and so I think at the year the Civil War started, the average slave was worth around $800, to $1,000. But an octoroon, or a person who was 1/4 black, or 1/8 black, or a quadroon, which was 1/4 black, was elevated in value, in value stature, right? I mean, and so the fact that we're not talking about so by the time that Europeans began to arrive here in the late 1800s in large numbers, the value proposition around what black is and what whiteness is has already been largely defined, not by the immigrant populations, but by the people who settled the country.
Okay, thank you. So you are basically saying that the constructs of the caste system were even developed as America was in the infant days. Is that what you're trying to say?
Absolutely. When you restrict marriage laws, when, we talked about, the 8 principles, well, two of them were misogyny and
what about the purity versus pollution?
so whether or not who you could have a baby with, right? Who you could procreate with, and who you could marry, right? Which is which is a purity test around what it means to be white. I mean, and those laws enter the American legal system long before the majority. The majority of the white population in America does not arrive on the shores until post-Civil War. America, and so by then what whiteness is has already been clearly defined by the law.
And you're saying that the need for having whiteness was to differentiate and to dehumanize and distinguish and have someone, you had to have someone at the bottom. Is that what?
That's exactly right. I mean, and so like for a long time, when I'm in my classroom, I have to explain to majority culture students is we didn't really get white people until the 1950s and 1960s. Largely up until then, they are Italian Americans and Polish Americans or Lithuanian Americans, and they are, and they live in ghettoized situations, meaning like large groups of people who collect together, and so look at the roots of Little Italy in Baltimore. These places were shanty towns at best, and they were not defined as white people when they get here.
And I think to that point, the evolving nature of what whiteness means, we look at a number of groups that have become white that didn't start out white, I think is an important and telling dynamic.
And it's a question that the author talks about this. This is a question that has been litigated,
Mm-hmm.
In the courtrooms, since America's founding, because being white was tied to being seen as some form of valid American.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else want to talk about either the construct of whiteness? If not, we can move on to the next question. Okay, I that there were some comments, written in the chat, and it talks about, the criminal justice system in the U.S. derives from criminal code of the slavery era, and it was startling to this person that the white Republicans in elected office are making this undeniably clear. So the question is, do you have any thoughts on how to counter the tyranny of the minority, the fact that a minority Republicans has oversized power and representation that can destroy our country? Does anyone want to take a stab at that question?
Ask it again, Ms. Sellers. Say that one more time.
Okay. I'm reading the question right now. And essentially it just says, do you have any thoughts on how to counter the tyranny of the minority? The fact that a minority Republicans has oversized power and representation that can destroy our country. That was the question that was raised.
I don't have an answer, but I have a thought.
Mm-hmm.
And the thought goes back to upbringing. So growing up in this country and going to school in the 70s, we were taught about the value of a democracy and how important it was and how it superseded any other form of government in the country, in the world. And, just so much praise and esteem was sort of heaped on the value of democracy. And then after the insurrection, it dawned on me that people were never really interested in democracy. They were interested in power and maintaining it by any means necessary. So as long as democracy was a means to an end, it was what was valued. But now as we see, and Isabel Wilkerson talks about by 2042, whites will constitute a numerical minority. Whites are working really hard to preserve a power base, and that power base no longer relies on democracy. And so that was sort of striking. That was striking to me. Just that this is not about democracy. This is more about retaining power.
I agree. I think that first off, like when we look back at the founding of this country, we have to also remember that it was under minority power. You had to own land,
Mm-hmm.
in order to vote, which carved large portions of white folks, out of democracy, if you will, right? I mean, and so this isn't the first time. And again, if we take a deeper look at our history, it's not the first time. January 6th was not the first time that a legitimate election or government was overthrown or an attempt to overthrow the legitimate election. There have been times in America where that was successful, but it's not, those stories have not, I'm referring to Wilmington, North Carolina, where an entire government was deconstructed, like voted in, deconstructed, and literally wiped away. So again, we have to kind of like be honest about like what we've been and who we've been.
I'm going to, since you started talking about democracy, I want to talk about that. And I was actually struck, I'll be honest, Taylor Brants, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian of the civil rights movement, he drops a question, and I highlight on page 352 of Caste, and what he says: if people were given the choice between democracy and whiteness, how many would choose whiteness? Respond to that. I'll read it again. The question that Taylor Branch raised, and it was quoted by, Isabel Wilkerson on page 352. And it says, if people were given the choice between democracy and whiteness, how many would choose whiteness? What do you think?
I think you can kind of glean the answer, like at least an estimation, based on the responses that people give to political pollsters, if you will. I've always hazarded the guess that somewhere between 25 and 35%, and that's not a fluid number. That number moves up and down. Are very uncomfortable with the change in the construct. I mean, because based on some of the responses that I've seen, they view this as this conversation that we're having in a win-loss proposition. That if things change, that this is an accounting problem. That you will get this, and I will get this, and and so on and so forth. Instead of looking at it like, I think that in many ways we don't have the personal capacity to look at it through our economies, economics, right? That you can kind of grow the pie, right? By addressing some of those issues, and there's more to dole out, right? I mean, so this idea that we continue to talk about these, our economic underpinnings as though it's an either or kind of thing, instead of looking at what is with margins, within the, outside the margins. I think that's where the growth is, where the growth opportunity is looking outside the margins.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on what Taylor Branch had said? Well,
I'm reminded of, oh,
Yes.
go ahead. Norma.
No, go right ahead. Who's, Norma, do you want to go first?
Quickly, I was just going to say that I think that we're at this point now where as a country, we're deciding on democracy and whiteness. And I think that there's this sort of tension and polarization. And, we're waiting to see what is going to prevail, especially when we see the fact that we could have lost our democracy potentially in January, for what we know as democracy.
Thank you. Okay. Marty, did you want to comment on that?
She's stuck.
Yeah, she's a little stuck right now. We're coming to the end, and what I want to do at this point, I thought it was a magnificent book, but I want each of the panelists to either choose one thing from the book or something that stood out to you. If you were to convince someone why they should read this book and why, this particular view of caste is important in understanding our history and perhaps in moving forward from where we are to where we need to be, what would you say? Give us your 2-minute spiel on why this book you feel is perhaps essential, and what part of it do you feel is essential reading, and why this is perhaps a book that should be on the reading list of all of our students to help them understand our history. So who wants to go first?
I don't mind going first. I feel like this book is just a tour de force, and that it really should be on everybody's reading list. I think she has so many. I think Isabel Wilkerson is brilliant. In my mind, I see this. See her as having like the lyricism of a poet, because as you read just this weighty history of the United States, she's able to capture everybody's attention, even as so many of the stories she tells are morbid. So she has the lyricism of a poet, but she has the pointedness of a historian. And so she's able to combine each of those elements sort of fluidly and in ways that capture people's attention. And so I think in that way, it's really powerful. I think she does a phenomenal job of creating a context in terms of what happened in US history. Again, as I said earlier, we have this sanitized version of what US history is. So there's so much that we don't know, and there's so much that we don't teach. And there's so much that we won't teach, particularly as we think about how people are teaching multiculturalism and topics like critical race theory. There's so much antagonism about that. So I think at every point things resonated with me, but I'm still going to go back to the 8 pillars, because the 8 pillars are the foundation. And I think of how a caste is created, perpetuated, reinforced, and whether we superimpose race, as she talks about in the US, class in India, or religion in Germany, it's still really telling, and can help people understand where we've been and how we've gotten to this point in history.
Thank you very much. And I'm gonna then turn to both Stephen and Marty to also respond. What was the best of this book? Should this be something that we use in our schools? And what do you think are the most important points made by Isabel Wilkerson that perhaps maybe they're new to how we look at the situation, but there's something that we can use to move forward from the point that we are now. Stephen, I'm going to come to you first.
So I have to agree with Norma. I mean, those 8 pillars were so incredible. I've been doing this work for quite a while.
Yes.
And folks who are familiar with me on the call know that I do a look back of local social systems to begin to kind of unpack like how we continue to behave in the current day framework. And so what I started to do and with my lectures is literally highlight those 8 pillars, right? In the beginning of my talk. And I ask people to, write them down and do a checklist of how many times I talk about each one of these pillars. I mean, and if I do a class for 3 hours, by the time we've reached the break, students are running up to me and saying like, oh, we're only halfway through. And I've checked off all 8 pillars at least 3 or 4 times. I mean, and so to really understand the reinforcing nature of those systemic pillars that have been literally put into the ground with such force, right? You can't fully turn around or change a paradigm unless you have some understanding of why it was constructed, what its intentional purpose was, right? And what the benefit proposition was to construct it in the first place. Because all we end up doing in the current day is circling around and dealing with the pain and the trauma of what it is that we just read. So focus on those 8 pillars. I'm in agreement with Norma. Those 8 pillars are strong. And if you dig down into them, each one of them, and just kind of understand how powerful each one of them was, then you really get a better understanding of how we behave today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that, Stephen. And Marty, I wanted to see if you had any comment that you would like to make.
I couldn't agree more on the 8 pillars. I would add this, that I think that understanding the difference between the word and the constructs of race versus caste are also, we get our knickers in a knot about the word race.
Yes.
But when we understand the difference caste and how that sort of was the foundation upon which we built racial inequity, racial disparity, and can you hear me? Because
yeah, we're not hearing you as well, Marty. You seem to be fading in and out. Unfortunately, must be the storm in your area. But I want to extend a word of thankfulness to all of our panelists in helping us to look at caste and to look at what we might learn from caste. I definitely want to invite everyone. This is going to be a continuing discussion. In the 4th quarter, we're going to be unpacking the 1619 project. Nicole Hannah-Jones has a new book that is coming out. We will be unpacking this on December 15th. I will definitely make certain that everyone that has attended, that you will definitely get notice of that. But the next thing that we'll be focused on will be the 1619 project. So again, thanks so much to everyone that has joined us. I apologize if your question we did not have enough time to answer that. But I do want everyone to know that this webinar has been recorded, and indeed we will be sending a link to everyone. And I'm looking at the chat right now. There are so many people that are sending a special thank you to all of the panelists. So I am so appreciative. And I'm certainly looking forward to everyone joining us as we continue to have these discussions on race, because we are all committed to making a change. Thank you very much, and good evening to all.